Well, morning. My name's Peter Robinson. I'm a computer technologist, a geek. So you're probably wondering why I'm talking about emotions. You know, the extrovert computer scientist is the one who looks at your shoes rather than his own when he's talking to you. Well, it turns out that emotions are terrifically important in human-to-human communication. And I'm interested in human-machine communication, and we can learn something about how to improve that by looking at the way people talk to each other. And I'll explain why as I go along. Now, a little bit of background. I'm going to start the talk in the 19th century with a couple of pioneering scientists in Cambridge, and then we'll go very much into the 21st century and see what we're doing with developments of their ideas. So the first person I want to mention to you is Charles Babbage. Charles Babbage was a professor of mathematics in Cambridge, the Lucasian professor, so following in the line from Newton through to Stephen Hawking and onwards. And typically of Cambridge professors, he never actually gave a lecture in Cambridge, and he spent most of his time in London, where he was interested in the idea of making machines that could perform calculations. And he designed a machine and built bits of it, but it was never quite completed. But arguably, it was a computer. It was programmable in the way that we think computers are. It had memory. There's a rather fine book which describes this as a cartoon strip, where the woman who produced this book, Sidney Padua, has produced this rather good illustration of what Babbage's computer might have looked like with a steam engine driving it and so on. And of course, it took another century before we actually got real computers, and now, of course, we all have several computers scattered around our bodies. Well, the other Victorian that I want to mention is Charles Darwin, another Charles. Charles Darwin, also a professor in Cambridge, and he was interested, as you know, in evolution, and a few years after publishing his book on the origin of species, he became interested in traits that might have developed in people that gave them an evolutionary advantage. And one of these might be the ability to understand what people were thinking by looking at their faces. Clearly, if I know something about what you're thinking by looking at your face, it gives me an advantage. I can change the way I act, and it's the way that people do converse. And so Darwin did experiments to see if people had the same understanding of different facial expressions. And he did this in collaboration with the Frenchman, Guillaume Duchesne de Boulogne, in Paris, who had been taking photographs of people with various emotional expressions. And in fact, Darwin's book on this that he published in 1872 was one of the first scientific works ever to use photographs. And you see one of the plates from the book there, and down the right-hand side are some of the Duchesne photographs. Actually, they're mainly photographs of a tramp that he pulled off the streets of Paris. And you see a neutral expression, a smiling expression in the middle when he'd been told a joke, and at the bottom, his expression where they attached electrodes to his face that activated the same muscles as the ones that you activate when you laugh, to see if he was happy when they did this. He wasn't. But Darwin also did other experiments using Duchenne's photographs to see if people had a common understanding of emotions. And one of the experiments involved crowdsourcing people's views of the photographs. Now, crowdsourcing, of course, in those days was before computers, so Darwin's method of crowdsourcing was to invite people round for dinner at his country house, and over drinks before dinner, he passed round the Duchenne photographs. These are full-plate photographs, about so big. We actually have them in the university library in Cambridge. And people wrote down or said what they perceived in the photographs. And Darwin put the results into a spreadsheet. These are the spreadsheets. They're just big sheets of paper. They're also in the university library in Cambridge. And you see the names down one side, Lord so-and-so, Lady so-and-so, numbers of the pictures across the top, and written in what people perceived. Well, we thought it'd be fun to repeat this experiment, so a couple of years ago we digitized the Duchenne photographs and put them on a website and actually crowdsourced, in the more modern sense, opinions, and we got something like 20,000 participants to rate these photographs and say what emotions they perceived in the pictures. And in fact, the two rows of labels under the pictures there. The top row is Darwin's consensus view, and the bottom one is the recent consensus view from our people on the internet. And it turns out, firstly, there is a consensus view of what the facial expressions depict. And secondly, it hasn't really changed much over the intervening 130 years. There's a slight change in language, but that's pretty well all. And of course, we know this is true. Emotions are something that are important in communication. It's very important to us for our internal feelings, but it's also important in communication. And if you're keen on Pixar animated films, which as a technologist I am, or if you have children, you've probably taken them to see Disney's film Inside Out, that actually depicts 5 of these very strong basic emotions in cartoon form. And Darwin studied about 7 emotions, which included these: anger, disgust, joy, fear, and sadness. Darwin also considered surprise, which Disney didn't in this film. There's not much surprise in Disney films, it turns out. But actually, these are very interesting emotions. They're very strong. You detect them from a still photograph of somebody's face, which was sort of the way that Darwin was doing his experiments. But actually, when we talk to each other, there are some other more subtle mental states, emotions, that we can only pick up over a few seconds. And these are to do with complex mental states that reflect what you're thinking, also known as cognitive mental states. Things like understanding or confusion, interest or boredom. So if you're lucky, I'm sort of looking at your faces now and seeing whether you're interested or bored, and if you're lucky, I'll actually change what I'm doing accordingly. It's a process that psychologists call mind reading. I'm actually trying to make inferences about what you're thinking and adapt what I do accordingly. And it's an important part of human-to-human communication. And people who can't do it are at a social disadvantage. It's people with autism spectrum conditions. And in that sense, computers are autistic. And that's what we've been trying to do something about. Now, in fact, if you look at the words we have for emotions, you find that there are these basic emotions, the fear, anger, disgust, that Darwin considered, and then there are these complex mental states. And you can, depending on how finely you want to divide them, you can probably pick out about 24 different categories of mental state that it would be interesting to understand. And the importance of this in the facial expression has been known for a long time. If we go back to the early 20th century, there was an actress called Florence Lawrence, shown in the pictures here. She was a Hollywood starlet, and in 1909, she was making 3 feature films a week. 3 a week, a rate of productivity you don't see in Hollywood nowadays. And the reason was, well, partly, the films were only 20 minutes long, because that's as long as you could get on a reel of film, so didn't take a lot of learning. And of course, she didn't have to learn her lines, because they were silent films. But the fact that they were silent meant that she had to convey a lot of the emotion through her face. And this advertising card for her shows you the variety of emotions that she can express. Although, interestingly, the one at the top left is called piety, and the one at the bottom right is called sadness. And I reckon they're indistinguishable. And perhaps there's something about the morals of Hollywood starlets, even in the early 20th century, that piety and sadness evoked the same sort of expression. Well, what that's actually telling us is that these are the sort of mental states that you need a little bit of evidence to collect. So we did an experiment. We made videos of people expressing different emotions and then cut them down and showed them very short sections and then longer ones and longer ones and longer ones to see how it improved their recognition of the emotions. And so essentially we took a video lasting about 6 to 10 seconds, cut it into 5 bits and showed them half a second, 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, or the full video. And what we noticed was if you showed people these basic emotions, the ones that Darwin studied, their recognition rate stayed pretty well constant. It's the top line in this graph. But for the complex mental states, it took about 2 seconds for the recognition rate to get up. In other words, people needed about 2 seconds evidence before they could form an opinion of what the mental state was that they were seeing. Fine, we thought. That tells us something about people. Perhaps that's the way we should build a computer system. So we put together a computer system that points a webcam at somebody's face and track features on the face, so round the eyes. Eyes are very important for expression of emotion. Round the mouth, see whether the mouth is open or closed, and round the face. And from these we can estimate the head pose, head up, head down, and eyes open, eyes shut, eyebrows raised, lowered, things like that, the facial features. And then from these we can detect what are called action units, which is a language that psychologists use when they're coding videos of people showing emotion. So things like head up and head down are two of these action units. And then we, from those, could infer gestures. So head up, head down repeatedly is nodding. And if you're nodding while smiling, that might well be agreement, while if you're nodding while not smiling, well, you might be falling asleep, you might be bored. It's interesting, the difference. So we have to combine these different levels. And we built a system that did that. This was some years ago, so here you see a video of a young lady who was being asked to act as if she was agreeing. You can see the various gestures down the left-hand side. Head nodding is coming through quite strongly. And across the bottom we see the inferred mental state. And the red curve was agreeing, which we picked up after about 2 seconds, and it then continued. And that's sufficiently good, we might repeat it. So after 2 seconds, it picks up. And then she thought she'd finished doing the acting and stopped and asked for confirmation. So we see a little burst of various other mental states like interest and concentration. And then she does a bit more agreeing because she was still meant to be acting. Well, we should probably do an experiment on you. I have a license from the university to do experiments on human subjects, as long as it doesn't involve the administration of drugs. So, sorry, no alcohol yet. I'm going to show you a video, well, this video, and I'll show it again in a moment. And then we'll crowdsource your opinion as to what mental state that woman is displaying here. And it's one of these 6, the 6 that we chose, because they're quite interesting for the purposes of human-computer interaction. So I'm going to show it to you again, and then I'll ask you if you think she was agreeing, concentrating, disagreeing, interested, thinking, or unsure. That is, she's unsure, not you're unsure. So here it goes again. Right, so a quick show of hands. This is, by the way, a lousy way of doing science, but never mind, we're going to do it anyway. Who thinks she was agreeing? That's about 0. Who thinks she was concentrating? Yep, 1 or 2. Yep, thank you. Who thinks she was disagreeing? Okay, about 12. Who thinks she was showing interest? 2 or 3. Who thinks she was thinking? Quite a lot, about 40% of you, I think. And who thinks she was unsure? Pretty similar, about 30%. And those results are pretty typical of what we get, and even what we get if we do a slightly more scientific approach, where we actually don't let you see what everyone else is voting for, which is not a good way of doing science. Well, of course, if we run that video through our system, what we actually see is, well, the system actually sees various different emotions being expressed there. So there's a little purple line at the beginning, which is concentrating, so that was at the beginning. And then the 2 that run through, the yellow and the brown lines at the top, are thinking and unsure, which very much reflects your impression, although there are little bursts of others, including disagreement and interested, which more or less reflects what you said. If we had to pick one of them, well, we'd pick the one that's sort of high for longest. It's the yellow line, which happens to be thinking, and that video was technically an example of thinking. Well, what this shows us is there is ambiguity in emotion. So this is unlike a lot of computer science. We're not looking for exact answers. We're looking for hints to a computer system. And it means we have to use this information in a rather different way. And in fact, this system is many years old now. We have a more recent one, which you see running here. The spots on the person's face are our face tracker, which is working out the outline of the face. And there are various diagnostics. We see the same action units across the bottom here, so things like brows raising and lowering and so on. And two different displays. There's the word that shows the dominant mental state at the bottom, so happy, neutral, angry. And then also the plot on the graph is showing us two axes that are often used to measure emotions. One's valence, running horizontally from negative to positive, and one's arousal, running vertically from passive to active. And actually you can sort of scatter different emotions around this and make inferences using that sort of information as well. It turns out that monitoring someone's facial expression, it's quite easy to get an idea of their valence, how happy they are. In fact, the student who built the system that we just played with before is now running a quite successful company in Boston, using this technology to do things like monitor audiences like you. So you just point a camera at an audience, pick all the faces out, analyze the faces, and average over all of them their impression while they're being watched while they're being shown previews of television commercials. And it's a way of telling whether the commercial's working or not, if people are amused at the right point in it. And she's also doing work for market research companies trying to analyze people's responses to things like presidential debates for elections. And actually it turns out you can correlate people's expressions while they're watching the debate at different points in the debate with their change in their political views over the duration of the debate. And that's quite a powerful tool for telling the candidates how to change what they're doing. Well, it turns out if you can study face, you can also study things like the voice. And people's voices are very expressive. Things, not what you're saying, but how you're saying it. So things like the pitch, the energy, the tempo, all give us information. And actually this tells us more about the arousal, the vertical axis in this graph. It turns out that the faces are pretty well general. So if you train our system, and these all use machine learning, on one set of faces, it transfers to other faces fairly easily, and indeed to people it's not seen before. And we have this language of these action units for describing what's happening in the face. There's nothing quite like that for the voice. So we have to use all sorts of measures, and in fact, it turns out that you can distinguish between a pair of states reasonably well, so a pair of conditions fairly well, but it's much harder just to pinpoint which condition it is. And it'll be different characteristics of the voice that distinguish two different conditions. So what we do is do all the pairwise comparisons. So if you're trying to distinguish 10 different mental states, you do a half times 10 times 9, 45 pairwise comparisons and see which win. And then you sort of combine them in something like a proportional voting system, and you can pull out the most likely mental state, and indeed you can pull out more than one mental state at once. And of course that's important because it turns out that having a single mental state actually happens, but more often people are expressing multiple mental states, and so it's important to be able to see that there may be more than one at once. And that's easy. You can do that just with the microphone on your computer. But it turns out that the face by itself and the voice doesn't tell us everything. If we look at these faces of tennis players here, they all have their mouth open and are looking, well, pretty stressed. But it's quite hard to tell what the actual emotion is just from the face. But if I show you their hands at the same time, it immediately becomes much more obvious. In fact, an open hand and an open mouth is a sign of sadness, and a clenched fist and open mouth is an expression of success. So actually we need to watch the people's hand gestures and body movements as well. Now this is a bit tricky. When we started doing this 10 years ago, if you wanted to watch someone's body, you had to wear one of these rather exciting lycra body stockings covered with reflective stickers. And we have a studio a bit like a motion capture studio, and you can then see if someone's movements on screen or as tracked through this system are looking, let's replay that again while I talk. So we can track your different points on the body. From that you can reconstruct a skeleton, and then you can see whether the movements are large and dynamic, which could well be anger or arousal, or rather sad and stoop, which might be unhappiness. And the trouble is with this, the movements are much more telling you what the person is doing rather than how they're doing it. So you have to break the movements up into tiny sections and then look at those. And even then, what you discover is who is doing it. This turns out to be quite a good biometric, actually. People's general disposition of their bodies is a sign of who they are rather than how they're feeling. So this is a system that you have to train on an individual, and then it turns out you can make quite good inferences about how they're feeling while they make the movements. Of course, this sort of rather elaborate motion capture system is quite expensive. It cost about £50,000, so it's not the sort of thing you're going to put on everybody, but our friends at Microsoft, actually 100 yards away from us in our computer lab in Cambridge, developed the software that runs the Kinect, which means you can now do this for about £100, which is more realistic. And of course, the more recent fitness bands and things like that, you can attach to a person, you can monitor the dynamics of their movement all day, and we're finding that that's really quite an interesting way of monitoring someone's well-being. We have a large study that we're doing, again, actually with my colleague Rosalind Pickard in MIT, doing a long study of patients at a couple of the hospitals there, monitoring progression of patients who are being treated for depression, just through things like the movement of their hands and the changes in their movement. So this actually is turning out to be quite an interesting technique, although dependent on the individual person. Well, so we can monitor people's faces, we can monitor their voices, we can monitor their body postures and gestures. Well, what about making computer systems that actually display emotions? And does it actually make a difference to a person's perception of the computer if the computer is reacting through facial expressions? So we tried some experiments, actually using a not particularly realistic robot, this monkey, wowie monkey, called Virgil, which has half a dozen motors inside the face. It's actually meant as a karaoke machine. You sing and the motors. So we ripped out the karaoke bit of it and put in our own control. We then got people to come and have conversations with it about what they'd been doing that day, and programmed the motors so that they either responded in a sympathetic way at appropriate times or made random movements at any time. And the observation was that people perceived this very obviously non-human robot as being more empathetic and more understanding if it actually mimicked their movement and did things at the appropriate time. So it turns out that people are affected by the display of something even as crude as this robot. So we then wondered, well, how realistic does it have to be? So we did a study, crowdsourced study on the internet, where we showed film clips of different sorts of robotic creature being abused by their owners. So everything from a mechanical automatic vacuum cleaner being thrown out of the window through a desk light that has a very human appearance in its eye, through a humanoid robot that's very obviously plastic, to one that's android, maybe a person, maybe not, through to a human. And these people showed increasing amounts of empathy the more realistic the subjects of the films were. So it seems that it's actually worth your while having a realistic human face. So fine, we went off and got a very good puppet maker in America to manufacture for us a robotic head. So this is a prosthetic head, and inside it there are now 28 motors replicating the motors in the human face. And we call him Charles. He's modelled on Charles Babbage, where I started. You see him on the right there. And here are some of his different facial expressions. The lighting in here is a bit bright, you can't see, but it actually has a very animated face. And we did experiments showing, again, doing the same sort of conversational experiments, which actually were not terrifically successful, I have to tell you. It turns out people find this just plain creepy. It turns out that when we look at each other's faces, we're very sensitive to very slight deviations from the expected pattern in the face. It's a way that humans tell that another human is ill, and therefore you should probably avoid them if you don't want to catch whatever they've got. So people found this a bit creepy, and they thought it was unwell. The one useful experiment we did do it with this was training medical students to deal with patients who had a condition called dystonia. Dystonia is where you have uncontrollable muscle movement in the face. And medical students, when they first encounter it, are very likely to show disgust in their own faces. And that's not a polite thing to do when you're meeting a patient. So it turned out this robot's really good at doing uncontrollable muscle movements. So we used it to desensitize the medical students and then monitored the medical students when they first met a real patient. And in fact, it worked. Although in truth, so did showing them a video of patients with dystonia. So perhaps this wasn't a real use of this robot. In fact, as far as I can make out, the best use of this robot is for publicity. It turns out the press adore robots. You say you've got a robot, they just come flocking in to film it doing things. We even got to show this on the Spanish equivalent of the Graham Norton show, if that means anything to you, a chat show on Spanish television a couple of weeks ago, where we programmed the robot to emulate the presenter of the show. Pablo, and went down very well with the audience. Actually, rather to my surprise, it all worked. I mean, one of my students who'd helped do some of this work said, "You are proposing to take an experimental tracker and an experimental robot and use it on live television." That's why we went to Spain to do it. I thought the audience would be small. It turns out it's actually the most popular television program in Spain, but and luckily everything worked and we had a good time. Well, what use is this? And one of the things that we've been considering is the possibility that monitoring people's faces will improve human-computer interaction. So what sort of interactions might we be interested in? Well, one that's taken our interest quite a bit is command and control systems. So you could imagine a model for this is somebody driving, and so we set up in our laboratory a system where we can have a driving simulator. We actually bought the same driving simulator, it cost about $10,000, that is used by the major car manufacturers, and we bought this, actually it's for gaming at home, this seat and steering wheel and so on, and programmed it all so we could take people on drives and then make them do mental arithmetic so that they got stressed to see if we could monitor the stress in their faces. Actually, it turned out they just didn't find the driving simulator very convincing. It had pretty poor graphics. You couldn't monitor how well the person was driving. You couldn't control the other cars. So one of my brighter students said, well, let's give up on the professional simulator. Let's get Grand Theft Auto. And it turns out that Grand Theft Auto has very good graphics. You actually can discover from it exactly where the person's driving. You can control the other traffic and the weather. You can make it more aggressive, more crowded. And it's got a very large route map. Now, for reasons that I won't go into, I'm sitting here with a robot as my co-pilot in the car. But here you see Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, which turns out to be quite a good route to drive people around and to make them do mental arithmetic. And we can even run our own sat-nav simulator on their roadmap to follow people around. And this was okay, except when we made people do too much mental arithmetic, they tended to crash the car, which of course was the idea. We wanted to see the stress in their faces while they were driving. But the trouble is, when they crashed, they just laughed. They knew it was a game, and they weren't taking it seriously. So we had to find something that actually gave them an emotional investment in what was going on. And so we tried a different approach. We kept the same control seat, but instead got some of these quadrotor drones that you can buy. These are the things that you normally drive with your mobile phone. We reprogrammed it so that it just runs on the Wi-Fi network in the lab, so you can drive it from our control seat with the video coming back from the drone to the screen in front of you, but it then goes off around the building. And it turns out that this has a much stronger emotional investment for the people using it. They can hear it going down the corridor. If they crash it, somebody has to go and pick it up. And so we actually did an experiment and saw that the physiological response, things like heart rate and sweating, were much stronger responses when people were flying the drone than when they were using the car simulator. So in fact, it turns out that this system of having a remotely controlled real object is quite a good way of doing experiments. It allows us to keep the people doing the experiment in our laboratory, so we can wire them up with sensors and monitor them. We can make them all do the same course with the same difficulty, so we can do scientifically meaningful experiments, and they take it seriously. And the driving simulator they didn't take seriously, and if you take a real car out on the roads, it's really very hard to repeat exactly the same traffic conditions every time you do it. So that's actually proved to be quite a successful way of extracting information about people. In fact, we are now working with a major car manufacturer looking at this sort of technology to improve the interactions between the car and the person. You can imagine that if you're driving through an unfamiliar city centre, you're lost, you're late for a meeting, the last thing you want is a satellite navigation system that tells you to make a U-turn. You'll probably have an accident. If it could see that you were concentrating and confused, it could actually modify the way that it gave you instructions, and it could do useful things. It could stop your mobile phone from ringing. It could turn off the radio in the car so you didn't have a distraction. It could even let you drive in the wrong direction for a bit until you recovered your composure and then bring you back in for another attempt. In fact, we've also been looking at the way we can use this video monitoring of the environment to realize that there's a lot of traffic around you, and by monitoring the traffic around you, we can make sure the car doesn't give you pointless bits of information like you need an oil change in 1,000 miles. You know, there's a right time to tell people that, and there's a wrong time, and we can actually adjust when it does it just by monitoring the driver's levels of concentration. And we've also used this, in fact, for a large European project that we're involved in, where we were interested in looking at trying to teach children with high-functioning autism about emotions. So this is children typically with Asperger's. They're very intelligent. They just don't recognize emotions in other people. And they know that they have a problem and would like to do something about it. And so we built a large consortium of half a dozen universities around Europe, put together a system that was a game that children could play that taught them about emotions. It showed them video clips. It had games where they had to recognize things. And one of the games was they had to emulate emotions. It turns out that mimicking is a very strong way of learning. And so we wanted to monitor the children while they were mimicking various emotions. And we can do that through video, using our system, through voice, using actually a different system from some colleagues in the Technical University of Munich, and a system that monitors body movement and gestures, again, by colleagues in the University of Genoa. And this then gives feedback and tells the child how they should be acting differently. And as they learn how to act different emotions, it teaches them how to recognize them. And we actually can see from using this as an intervention with children with high-functioning autism that it actually does make a difference. So this is a major project recently completed. But just to conclude, when Darwin wrote his book on the expression of the emotions in man and animals, he did include animals. And Darwin showed pictures of a dog and a cat showing, I think, ready to fight was the way he described the top two, and being affectionate, the bottom two. And there are a lot of expressions that are shared. They're expressed rather differently in animals from people, different species. And we've been interested in one particular species, which Darwin didn't look at. Our department in Cambridge is next door to the veterinary school. And the veterinary school are very interested in sheep, and in particular, happy and sad sheep. So we've been looking at 5 different indicators of pain in sheep. And so these are things like their eyes, which sort of go down to slits as they are in pain, their cheeks, which sort of pull in, their ears, which fold backwards, their lips, which pull downwards. Sheep normally smile. You probably didn't know that. There's a useful fact for today, but they stop smiling when they've got foot rot, roughly speaking. And in their nostrils, the shape of the nose changes from a U shape to a V shape. And it would be really useful if we could monitor sheep in the wild and put a camera, say, near a feeding trough in a field, and as the sheep come, have a look at their faces and see if they're happy. And you could use things like RFID tags to identify individual sheep that have got a problem. Of course, the first thing we have to do is to analyse the face. Well, so we've been building a face tracking system that tracks feature points on a sheep's face. It's sort of like a human face, only it's different training data. And we're now quite good at tracking things like the eyes, the nostrils, and the ears in particular on sheep. And we're now trying to see if we can build a system that then makes the higher level inferences from this, going back to the same approach that we took with people. That is, we now want to make inferences about their mental state. Well, to be exact, about whether they're in pain or not. And that's a current project. Well, I have given you a very fast summary of what is a huge area of research. The idea of computing with emotions requires all sorts of things. We need to have a language for emotions to start with. And I've talked about, well, 2 different ones really. The classification using words, either a small number of very strong mental states or a larger vocabulary of cognitive mental states. And also classification using a dimensional system. How, what is your valence, happiness, sadness, and what is your activation from passive to active. I haven't really talked much about data collection. All of our systems use machine learning. We need lots of training data to keep them going. We have to collect that. We have to label it. We found ingenious ways of getting it labeled for us by turning the labeling job into a game on Facebook, and people compete to see who can label best. And that means they all do it for free, which is good. We've been doing these inference systems that then generalize from the labels on the training data to the labels that we want to apply to video collected in the wild. I've talked a little bit about synthesis and robots, and I've talked a little bit about different modes. Faces in particular has been a strong point with us, but also things like voice, body posture, and gesture. And we're making progress in all of these, but the thing is we are nothing like as good as people are. And so what we do at the moment is we have to start with a particular application, like car driving, like teaching autistic children, or we've also done systems for online shopping that monitor people using online shopping systems through the webcam in their computer to get feedback as to what's interesting them. And if you start with a particular application, then you can build a system around it. And as I say, steady progress is being made, but it's a while before we'll actually read minds like people do. Although, of course, as soon as we do, there will be ethical issues to do with privacy, and we'll return to that, no doubt, during the questions. So I should just finish by saying, of course, I don't actually do any of this. I have a large team of very bright people who do all the actual work. This is they. Incidentally, however many there are here, it's about 18 people from, I think, 15 different countries. It's one of the nice things about university work. We are an international collaboration. But thank you very much for your attention.